When I originally wrote and lined up my Bops from the Basement series, I would have only had 2 more entries left to film, and that would have been it. There were so many cassettes and CDs I ended up leaving out, either because I just didn't really have much to say about them, or there's something problematic about the content or the artists themselves, or I simply forgot about them, or I would even discover one after the fact. So I thought it would be a great opportunity for me to start practicing these sort of improvised, unscripted videos, because honestly, this entire year, I've just been so burnt out. You've noticed I didn't do a whole lot of writing. I've mostly been posting my self-tapes. I do want to eventually get back into it in the new year. And I just thought, instead of posting the self-tapes all the time, and I will have more coming, I thought I would mix it up a little bit by doing these. And there's also another series I have coming up that will also be unscripted. And it's just a really great opportunity for me to practice, to get comfortable, get used to the idea that I can't always have something prepared beforehand. Maybe I could have, ideas in my head in terms of what I want to talk about and what I want to say and how, but I have to learn to not rely so much on structure and attempt something like this. It is a little bit nerve-wracking for me, but I'm hoping with time I will feel a lot more confident about it. So without further ado, let's get into the video. I'll be talking about Blackstreet, an R&B group that debuted with almost exclusively New Jack Swing songs. This was sort of an interesting time period for popular music because this was sort of like the late 80s, early 90s, so we were sort of phasing out of the rock music, the hair metal, Europop, all those things that were popular sort of for that decade, and now going into one where we're sort of having this clash between grunge and like the harder rock sounds, and then you've got like the rap, hip-hop, like really heavy stuff. New Jack Swing was trying to sort of bridge the gap between pop and R&B hip-hop. It's sort of like a mix of these things. But the thing with New Jack Swing, and this is coming from somebody who actually really loves the genre, it has a very specific sound. You pretty much have to combine it with at least one other genre. Otherwise, it's not going to sound fresh, it's not going to sound diverse. Going back to Blackstreet, right? This is when they were starting out. They released this album in 94, so that would have been like pretty much the absolute end for New Jack Swing. And here's the thing. Their songs, pretty much all of them, are really enjoyable, but in isolation. Because when you actually sit there and listen to this album, from the first to the 20th track, it becomes really monotonous, like not even halfway into it, because pretty much all of the songs sound exactly the same. There's maybe like 1 or 2 that stand out. The one that immediately comes to my mind is Love's in Need, and that one verges into a more soulful sound. That's a problem because, and especially during that time, this was still when artists were putting out really like plentiful albums. These were I'm talking like 15 to 20 tracks. You know, sometimes you had your interlude, sometimes you had more like spoken word and some more like creative stuff in between that's like, you know, shorter. It's just more focused on the vocals as opposed to the music. And again, this was one of those albums. And when you have pretty much every single song be almost the exact same thing, very little variation, maybe some tracks are a little faster and some are a little bit slower, it's not going to be very engaging or exciting to listen to. It's one of those things where you have to listen in short bursts. And that's sort of the problem with this album. And again, there's nothing actually wrong with any of these songs. It's just that when you're trying to sell an album, when you're trying to convince someone to listen to an album, and especially in this day and age where we have streaming, it's more about the singles. Very few artists are able to capture their audience. And I'm talking about the mainstream right now. Very few of them are able to engage their audiences with full albums. And these days, you know, you're lucky if you could get 10 songs, which constitutes a full album. Most of the time, you get extended plays, which could be anywhere from like 5 to 7 songs. A lot of the time, artists are putting out singles. Now, obviously, you have your indie artists, you've got your underground artists, alternative, who are not trying to conform to any kind of standard. They all have their own fan bases. They know what works for them. Totally different story. That's not what I'm talking about here. You also have other problems with New Jack Swing. The fact that it wasn't very well received by rappers and hip hoppers. And again, I want to reiterate that they were really big during like the early to late 90s. And then, you know, they had their resurgence in the mid 2000s when it was sort of a repeat of the 90s in a sense. Like you had them up against the alternate rock. Even you had like emo and some metal stuff in there. They were sort of the two giants during both time periods. So New Jack Swing, it wasn't really appreciated as much. It was kind of seen as like, oh, this is sort of the thing that you would, you know, hear in commercials and cheesy movie soundtracks and that sort of thing. It wasn't really taken all that seriously. It was seen more as pop than anything else. And then, of course, it was very much targeted toward women. And as we all know, things that are designed specifically for women, especially for teen girls, it tends to get mocked. And if you think that it was just happening then, need I remind you, it still very much happens now. We saw it with the Barbie movie, where there were a lot of complaints that the movie felt like it wasn't being marketed towards certain types of people. And, you know, this is a discussion for another time, but I do just want to quickly point out that not everything necessarily has to be for any particular demographic. In retrospect, a lot of people are going to end up looking back fondly, regardless of whether they felt it was written for them or not. It happens a lot, and so don't be quick to write things off. Let people enjoy what they want, that sort of thing. Do I think, with all that in mind, that an album like this would have worked now? Honestly, probably not, at least not in the mainstream. Again, for the reasons that I talked about earlier. I do wish that the genre could be given a chance again. We kind of did see it in the mid 2010s, I want to say, like with Bruno Mars, Jason Derulo. They had their attempts with, you know, mixing in the genre with their music to freshen things up a little bit, which was great. But again, you have to try really hard, especially because R&B itself is one of those genres that's constantly evolving and taking different shapes in order to keep up with the current standards. Now, whether you agree with that approach or not, that's up for debate. We could certainly talk about that in another video. But I do think that it's worth revisiting and experimenting with it a little and see what different things could be done with it. I'm all for being pleasantly surprised. I already love the genre personally, but I would not readily recommend it to someone who didn't grow up with it, or at least wasn't old enough to have like their parents pass it down to them, or to be exposed to that kind of media when it was being heavily featured, when it was sort of the thing and all the big artists were on it. And at the end of the day, this was Blackstreet's first album together as a group. At least I admittedly don't know that much about them. I imagine that with later albums, they were able to try different things and establish their sound. And I did hear, unfortunately, some of the members did pass away. Very sad. Rest in peace. But I don't want to give them too hard of a time, because especially during that time when you're first starting out, you can't always do things the way you want to do them necessarily. You just don't have that street cred yet. It's definitely a part of it. So oftentimes you are pressured to cash in on what's currently popular. And New Jack Swing for a short amount of time was. So that was sort of what they were going in with. The issue was, on top of having so many songs, they did lean way too heavily into it, and so you end up with an album that is very bloated, it's very monotonous. It's one of those things where it works really well in the background, but in terms of like engaged listening and going back to it constantly, finding ways to sort of integrate it into like your daily listening and into your life and routine, not so much. And it's really too bad. These guys were, and still are, incredibly talented. I say it's worth checking out their other stuff to see what they have. And I do think that this album is still worth looking back on out of curiosity, to hear New Jack Swing in its almost purest form, and to get to know how that was produced at the time. It's definitely sort of a time capsule of that particular era that I think is worth looking back on. Especially if you're not ashamed to listen to songs that are about having fun, going out, dating, relationships, sort of figuring all that out. Not everything has to be some major statement piece, and hopefully we'll someday get past the point of judging people for the type of music that they enjoy. Unless, of course, it's truly low effort or truly offensive or created with AI.